Tonight, we honor America's 56th Secretary of State, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Please welcome Jim Byron, President and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Nixon Library on this very special evening. Tonight, I'm going to ask you all to head back to your seats as we begin tonight's program. It is a high honor and a distinct pleasure to welcome back to the East Room Dr. Henry Kissinger. We honor this very special individual, and we pay tribute tonight to his decades of service in this country and in this century that he helped build and shape. So let us now honor this country, our country, as I invite the 12th Division of the United States Marines to present the colors. Please stand for the presentation of the colors.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that a flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated, and thank you, Madeline Hernandez, for such a beautiful rendition. Dr. Kissinger has written a new book, his 20th in the course of his life, and this one truly is a must-read. We're going to hear more about leadership and from our distinguished guest and honoree this evening, but before we enjoy dinner, I want to recognize a few individuals especially important to the Nixon Foundation. I'm going to ask the Board of Directors of the Nixon Foundation now to stand beginning with Ambassador Robert O'Brien, Chairman of the Board, Lisa Arduous, Christopher Nixon Cox, Steve Craig, Gavin Herbert, Larry Higbee, Sandy Quinn, Dr. Daniele Strupa, Governor Pete Wilson, and Charlie Zhang. I also want to recognize those who served with Dr. Kissinger in the Nixon administration: Colonel Jack Brennan, Dwight Chapin, Frank Gannon, Larry Higbee, and Bruce Willihan. Thank you for being here tonight. Please also join me in welcoming the Governor of Oklahoma, the Honorable Kevin Stitt. Thank you for being here, Governor. In a not too coincidental historical footnote, the sparkling wine that you're enjoying this evening was generously donated by Schramsberg Vineyards, because this same California wine was served 50 years ago in Beijing, when in a diplomatic coup, President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger visited the People's Republic of China. I want to thank all of our benefactors who supported this event. Their names are on the screens running next to me, but allow me to pay particular tribute to our event co-chairs. The Arduous family's relationship with President Nixon and with Dr. Kissinger goes back decades. Thank you, Lisa, for being such a strong leading champion of the Nixon legacy and for throwing your passion for civics and history education into co-chairing this special evening. Thank you. In addition, Ling and Charlie Zhang are two of the most inspiring and kind-hearted individuals that you will ever meet. Charlie is famous for frequently saying that without President Nixon having gone to China, there wouldn't be a Charlie Zhang. Well, tonight we may have to add that without Dr. Kissinger, there may not be a Charlie Zhang. So thank you, Ling and Charlie, for also co-chairing tonight's event. I also want to recognize Dr. Jane Zhang, the Director of Tourism of the Richard Nixon Foundation, for her special support of this evening, and her husband, Douglas. I am thrilled now to announce that thanks to your generosity and the generosity of many who supported this evening but could not be with us, we have raised $700,000 this evening, which will enable the Nixon Foundation, absolutely. This will enable the Nixon Foundation to hire its first Director of Education, to develop and spearhead the tools necessary to teach America's middle and high school students civics education and about the basics of our Constitution. We're going to host training sessions for middle and high school teachers every summer about U.S. foreign policy. We're going to develop online and in-school curriculum about American civics. We're going to establish travel and research grants for scholars studying, writing, and publishing on Richard Nixon's life and presidency. And this will allow us to deepen ties with institutions of higher learning. There are tonight 20 students from Chapman University's Presidential Studies Center that are with us in the audience, studying and understanding the important role of the American presidency in our national life. So thank you to Chapman and Dr. Strupa for organizing that partnership. You all tonight have much to be proud of, and we owe Dr. Kissinger a great debt of thanks for being here this evening. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for what you've done, and enjoy your dinners this evening.
Good evening. I have the incredible privilege and honor of posing a toast for Dr. Henry Kissinger. His friendship with our family shaped the future of our family. When my dad was asked to act as ambassador to Spain, he was conflicted as to whether or not he should take the role. And he asked Dr. Kissinger's advice, and Dr. Kissinger advised him that when the President of the United States asks you to serve your country, you serve your country. My dad listened. He greatly admired Dr. Kissinger as his friend and took his advice and took on the role. Dr. Kissinger has shaped our world, our country, and our history. And we are so lucky to have him here and his wisdom. It's just a blessing to have him here with us tonight. So please raise your glass and a toast. The national treasure. Thanks, Dr. Kissinger.
Thank you for your, Lisa. Thank you for your kind words. And it's such an honor for me to be present on this occasion, that your generosity has made in part possible. And in the most difficult periods of President Nixon's life, the Argyle family were always faithful and thoughtful and provided an inspiration to his life and to his family and to his friends. So it's in this spirit I would like to propose a toast to friendship that has been expressed by so many, by all of you in this room, and to Lisa Argyle for what she has meant to, what her family has meant to our country, and to President Nixon.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here again in the East Room with so many wonderful old friends and so many, many wonderful new friends. My name is Bruce Willihan. I joined the campaign in 1968, 56 years ago, and traveled every mile with the president, as did two great friends who are here also, Larry Higbee, who was on the board, and Dwight Chapin, the president's man. And if you haven't read the book, get it, it's wonderful. But my job tonight is to ask you all to raise a glass in a toast to the champion peacemaker, President Nixon.
Please welcome Ambassador Robert O'Brien, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a great honor it is to be here this evening and have a chance to introduce my good friend Henry Kissinger and Frank Gannon. This is my first public appearance as chairman, and so I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Jim Kavanaugh for his many years of service to the foundation and the library. And I'm smart enough to understand that Jim has, those are big shoes to fill. I don't expect to fill them, but I hope to keep the ship on the same course that Chairman Kavanaugh charted for us, and I'll do my best on that front. Great to be here with a couple of governors, Governor Wilson, who will always be my governor of California, and his beautiful First Lady Gail. I told him before, I said I think they've got a Dorian Gray photo in their bedroom or something, because they keep getting younger every time I see them, and the rest of us just get older. And then we've got Governor Kevin Stitt, who came in from Oklahoma. We need to import Republicans now, and if you haven't met Kevin, go say hello to him, because he's a terrific guy and he's got a big future in the Republican Party, and you're going to hear from him again. I'm pretty certain of that. So come say hello to the governor when you get a chance. So Frank Gannon is going to interview Henry tonight, And Frank has an amazing CV. Frank's got one of these CVs that you'd gladly trade your CV with his in a second. He graduated from Georgetown in Washington. He then went on and got a master's from the London School of Economics. But that wasn't enough. He had to get a PhD from Oxford as well. So, following his time at Oxford, he worked with Randolph Churchill, Sir Winston's son, and worked on the magisterial biography that Randolph started, and then Sir Martin Gilbert took over from there. And I've got both those books on my shelf at home. So he then returned to the U.S. and, of course, became a White House Fellow for President Nixon. He went on to the Domestic Policy Council staff and was a special assistant to the president. And back in 1974, he flew home to California on August 9th with the president aboard Air Force One. And I was there, Frank. Some of you have heard this story. My parents were big Nixon people, so they loaded the kids up in the station wagon, and we drove out to El Toro for that homecoming. Frank then spent a couple of years organizing and researching the president's memoirs. And after that, because he hadn't done enough, he went back to Washington, and he worked with Senator Hines, was a editor of the Sunday Review magazine, and a segment producer for Late Night with David Letterman. And so hopefully we're going to get a top 10 list from Frank at some point. In 1994, he helped steer NBC's News's coverage of President Nixon's funeral, and today Frank consults for the Nixon Foundation and several top TV shows. So Henry, how do I introduce someone who literally needs no introduction? I mean, this is a tough one. In 1938, Henry was 15 years old, and he and his family wisely fled Nazi Germany. 5 years later, he was called up to the U.S. Army, and he served in the European theater and fought in World War II, and he was awarded the Bronze Star for bravery, and he also became a U.S. citizen in that war. A lot of people don't know that about Henry. So he's a soldier. He went to Harvard. He taught at Harvard. And then in 1969, January, Richard Nixon was sworn in as President of the United States. And by his side was Henry Kissinger as the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, or what we call the National Security Advisor. He became one of the greatest diplomats of the 20th century and perhaps the last millennia. Henry's the sole surviving member of President Nixon's cabinet, and he's never in all these years stopped serving the United States of America. Henry was the 7th National Security Advisor. I was the 27th National Security Advisor, so there were 20 between us. Jake Sullivan, the current National Security Advisor, is the 28th. But there are 26 of us, and the reason for that is Robert Cutler and Brent Scowcroft served 2 non-consecutive terms. There are 13 of us that are still alive, and Henry is the dean of our small little club. Now, Henry did something really important for us. He got us our office in the West Wing. We've got a great office. Only the small reception area that some of you have been to in the West Wing and the cabinet room are between the National Security Advisor's office and the Oval Office. And as you know, up until that time, the NSA's office was down in the basement. But in the West Wing, real estate's really important. And Henry got us a great, he really, I won't tell the story, but he commandeered the space for us. So Henry, thank you for getting us that office. And the last thing I told to Jake Sullivan, I was the last person from the Trump administration to leave the White House. We'd said goodbye to the president earlier that morning. Jake and I did kind of the last bit of our transition. And I said to Jake, Henry got us this office in 1969. Do not let anybody get this office from you. And I was thinking of Susan Rice, who had been a national security advisor, but was now upstairs as the domestic policy advisor. And so thank you. So my conversations with Henry, like all conversations between a current national security advisor and the past national security advisor or his past colleagues or her past colleagues, are confidential. But I'm going to disclose one tonight. 3 years ago this very month, it was clear that the Democrats were going to impeach President Trump. And I went to see Henry in his home in Manhattan, in his apartment. And I was waiting in the entryway. I'd met him before, but didn't know him well. And without any pleasantries, Henry walked in and looked at me. I don't do a good Henry imitation, but he said, "Good job on Pottinger." Now, Matt Pottinger was my deputy, and so that was the first thing he said. And then he said, I won't do his great gravelly voice justice, but he said, "You and I are the only ones who face this thing." And he said, "Let's go sit down and let me tell you how to navigate what's coming." And in that moment, Henry became more than a colleague. He became a mentor and a friend. And over the next year and a half, I talked with Henry countless times. On my way to an arms control summit in Geneva with General Patrushev, I was on the phone with him over the Atlantic. Flying to Jerusalem to negotiate with the Abraham Accords with Bibi Netanyahu, I was on the phone with Henry. Before the final Serbia-Kosovo peace talks, when we brought the president of Serbia and the prime minister of Kosovo to the White House, and we couldn't get the deal quite done, it was Henry who gave me great advice on how to get that done. We had a few confrontations with China, and at every one of those, Henry shared his wisdom with me. So at every turn, Henry was there to make a difference. He made me a better national security advisor. And I'm certain if you talk to anyone who came after Henry, who held my position, and probably I'm sure it's true with Jake Sullivan today, each one of them would have stories like I've told you tonight about Dr. Kissinger. You know, it was over 50 years ago that he stepped into that office in the West Wing for the first time, and he's continued to keep America safe during all those 50 years. So thank you, my friend. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry Kissinger and Dr. Frank Gannon to the stage. They'll begin their short their conversation after a short video produced by the Nixon Foundation. Again, thank you all very much for being here tonight. And for our friends from the UK, condolences on the loss of Queen Elizabeth II, and we'll be keeping the royal family and the United Kingdom in our prayers, and keeping King Charles III in our prayers. So thank you all very much. God bless you, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Welcome back. It's good to have you back at the Nixon Library, and good to be back talking to you about another book. One of the 6 profiles of leaders that you concentrate on, or that you present in the book, is Richard Nixon. And I understand that you want to say some things before we begin. You want to say some things about President Nixon.
I want to say what an honor and joy it is for me to be back here in the Nixon Library, which is a tribute to a president who combined vision and courage in an extraordinarily complex period in which the unity of the country was disintegrating, and in which the international system was being attacked in so many places. I had the privilege of being associated with Richard Nixon, and most of you may not know that I had never met him when he offered me the second highest appointed position in the government. We had never met. I had never talked to him before. And what is perhaps even stranger is that I had in fact been closely associated with Nelson Rockefeller, who was a principal opponent of President Nixon in a number of primaries. I was not on the political side of Nelson Rockefeller. I mean, on the political staff of, but I was a close friend and remained a close friend. So when President Nixon invited me to talk to him a few weeks after his election, he didn't do it to offer me anything. We had a 2-hour conversation as if we were college professors about the state of the world. And the only indication he gave of anything special is when I left, he said to Bob Haldeman, whom I hadn't met before, to establish a telephone line to me in Cambridge, as if Cambridge was a place which didn't have adequate communication. But that sentence was to tell his staff that he was moving in the direction. Anyway, the significant aspect is that when we began working together, what Nixon spent most of our meetings on was reflections on where America should be going and how the world should be brought towards peace and how the security of this country could be preserved and fostered, and that he did not present these ideas as separate issues, but insisting that they had to be linked together. So in that period of 5.5 years, I saw peace in the Middle East being advanced, the war in Vietnam ended on the terms that we set from the beginning, that people who had relied on America should not be sacrificed, and the Russian threat was faced down in a number of places, and the opening to China was achieved. But people today often ask me, what would Richard Nixon do today? And I'm sure I know what he would do. He would create a situation that makes it clear that threatening American security is too dangerous and cannot be attempted. But he would also simultaneously be in a dialogue with China to convince them that if they moved in a more peaceful direction, there is a positive future they can achieve while the United States remains strong and powerful. He would not go on one side of the equation or the other. But Frank is here to elaborate or get me to elaborate on some of these things. So let me thank you all for the tribute you are paying tonight, not to me, but to a distinguished president whom I have listed among 6 outstanding world statesmen in my recent book. And so I want to thank you for the courtesies that have been shown to me here, and also for the confidence all of you in this room have shown to the memory of Richard Nixon, which is important and crucial at this moment when internal division and international chaos are threatening ever more strongly. Thank you very much.
Before we move on to Leaders, which is an extraordinary book, not least because it's so readable and accessible and understandable and has such impact, it was just a week ago, it's hard to believe, it was a week ago that Queen Elizabeth died. And the outpouring of emotion and affection has been extraordinary, not just in the UK, but in America and around the world. Are you surprised by that? How do you analyze it? Was the Queen a leader? Was Queen Elizabeth a leader?
Was she
a leader?
Nixon was a strong leader. He led within the framework of his own psychology. So that Nixon did not like to enter a room and pound the table and say, we've got to do the following 5 things. What he typically did is to evoke views. What he rarely did is then to make a decision right away. But he would see that he would make it quickly and decisively. And one classic example is in the spring of 1972, an election year, and he had been widely accused of not doing enough for peace. He had a summit meeting scheduled in Moscow at the end of May. And at the beginning of May, or actually in April, the North Vietnamese started a major offensive with Russian help, attacking all over Vietnam. So Nixon sent me to Vietnam, not to Paris, for a meeting with the Vietnamese to make a final offer, which they turned down. Whereupon Nixon ordered a blockade of North Vietnam 2 weeks before he was supposed to go to Russia. It was the unanimous opinion, nearly, of the media that this would be the end of the any negotiation with Russia, and that it would drive the Vietnam War to an international war. The opposite happened. He went to Russia and made a series of agreements which could have been and were in many ways a turning point, specifically an agreement that limited the total number of advanced nuclear weapons
SALT.
on both sides.
The SALT Treaty.
Called SALT, yes, Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement. Or during the Mideast War that occurred in 1973, and the issue was what replacement of losses we would make to Israel, and how the American supplies would be delivered. And there were many complicated plans how to do this in a way that did not engage us in a manner in which the Arab world would be driven totally against us. This went on for about 3 days. And then Nixon said, we will pay as much of a price for sending one airplane as for sending 100. And he ordered that all the deliveries come through the American military airlift. And that was another turning point in the war, because within 2 weeks of that decision, a ceasefire was achieved because the local battles turned in the American direction. And the key to Nixon's thinking on these matters was expressed in a view one often heard. You pay the same price for doing something halfway as for doing it completely. And if you don't know what to do tactically, ask yourself what you should want to be the end result of the process. And so as a leader, he would not proclaim this in an aggressive public manner, but it guided his conduct. And so I, coming in fresh, was increasingly, with the passage of not very much time, accepting these principles. And that enabled us, he on the conceptual side and I on the implementing side, to achieve what I think it's a unique record in foreign policy in the entire post-World War II period.
This is the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, which we will be marking here with a major conference next year, and where on Yom Kippur, the day on which Israel was least prepared to be attacked, the Egyptians and the Syrians through the Sinai and through the Golan Heights attacked, and it was a surprise attack, and it was devastating, and it looked like Israel was in trouble. And so, in effect, not to put too fine a point on it, Nixon saved Israel by insisting on sending whatever was needed to stabilize the battle. And then you, in your shuttle diplomacy, which was a remarkable feat of persistence, nothing else, but of diplomacy, you set the stage for a new era in a very old and troubled area. In 1974, in June of 1974, Nixon made a trip to the Middle East, an extraordinary trip. He was the first president to go to Syria, first president to go to Israel. He went to Saudi Arabia and Jordan. He squared the circle by starting in Egypt, in Cairo, being cheered by 1 million Egyptians, and then he ended by addressing the Knesset in Jerusalem. And 8 weeks later, he had to resign. It's impossible to know, but what plans did you and President Nixon have to build on that trip and the relationships that had been built? What were the next steps, had he not had to resign?
Well, I have always considered that Nixon's leaving office at that time was a tragedy, because we had achieved a point where the relationship where we were the key element in the relationship between Russia and China, because we designed our policy so that in each step we were closer to either Russia or China than they were to each other. So we always had the superior bargaining position. And we were quite convinced, and the conduct of both sides reflected it, that we could have made quite significant progress. In the Middle East, there were disengagement agreements already between Egypt and Israel. There were a whole set of agreements. At that time, still, Iran was on the American side. And if it would not have been, what defeated the pro-American government in large part was that there was no succession to Nixon that could conduct the affirmative policy he had conducted before. So the position, and we were at that moment beginning negotiations about how to relate technology to its political impact in the world. So he left an important legacy, but the ultimate legacy of a leader should not be the things he does himself, but the process he starts and the thought that he leaves behind on which future societies can build. And that opportunity we lost by the tragedies of that year. And we're in a comparable period now where a combination of international crises and domestic dilemmas produce a kind of paralysis at a moment when forward movement and creative ideas are the principal need.
I see a picture of Golda Meir and you and the president here. She was not prime minister at the time of the war, although in the Knesset speech he toasted her, and his relationship and your relationship with her was recent and current and deep. Did you consider her for inclusion in leaders?
Well, Golda Meir was a spectacular person, and she could make herself look like your favorite grandmother. But she was also very tough. But she performed a very crucial mission because she was prime minister when the 1973 war started. And she managed to keep her country together in the early days when it looked as things might turn badly. And then she managed a relationship with the United States that was an underpinning for the strategy. As the war turned in a way in which the Russian position was undermined, and therefore the American position was increased. This had to be reflected in some diplomacy. And for Golda Meir, who had come to that country when it was at the very beginning of the immigration, the idea of giving up any territory was, for whatever reason, and my wife used to say some of the best dramatic performances she ever saw was when Golda and I were arguing about nuances of agreements. But she was a strong leader for a country that had fought 5 wars in 20 years. And she was personally an inspirational person.
I misspoke. She was the prime minister during the war, very much so. She referred to President Nixon at one point as my president because of how he had saved Israel by sending all the planes. She wasn't prime minister at this point during the 74 trip, which is why singling her out with the toast at the Knesset was a particularly elegant gesture on his part. All of this is seen. I mean, the greater, as you just alluded, the greater accomplishment was Nixon oversaw the extrication of the Soviet Union from the Middle East. I mean, this was a process that he
That was and there too I have to say the intrusion of the Soviets militarily into the Middle East started just before the Nixon administration came in. And early in the administration, Nixon and I had a discussion of our strategic goal. And I forget who it was who said that the expulsion of Soviet military force from the Middle East should be a principal objective. But whoever said it in our private conversation, Nixon said, why don't you say that publicly and say that that is our objective? And that was very early in the game. And all hell broke loose when I said it. Of course, I said it to give for Nixon's view to be put on the table. But when his term was over, it had been substantially achieved in Egypt and in Syria.
Nixon was a master of grand strategy, and the foundation in November is going to be having a grand strategy conference in Washington. What is grand strategy? How was Nixon a grand strategist? He was always always playing at you, which is why great minds thought alike on that. Which is why, although you hadn't known him and it worked for Nelson Rockefeller, you were the perfect pair because great minds thought alike, and you thought in terms of consequences and indirection. Now I forget my question. I got so carried away.
No.
Grand strategy, thank you. What is grand strategy, and what made Nixon a grand strategist?
What made Nixon a great grand strategist is that he was not, he of course was perfectly willing to address the problem of the day. But what occupied him most in the conversations that he and I conducted practically every day on what was supposed to go on was the definition of how we could be both strong and visionary. Too often our domestic debate is conducted as a debate between people who want to do away with weapons and others who think you can do everything with weapons. And Nixon's great strength was his determination to link the two together. In fact, he sent in the third or fourth week of his administration, he sent out a memorandum to all departments concerned with foreign policy to tell them he wanted to link the various objectives almost like an artistic measure. I can give you one example in the China relations. Nixon had written an article about opening to China that was quite prescient, very prescient. But it couldn't, as an article out of government, explain exactly how you do that?
This was the article Asia After Vietnam that was in the fall of 1967 issue of Foreign Affairs, and
Right.
it was a seminal piece of thinking.
But then, very early in his administration, there were military conflicts that nobody had expected between Chinese and Russian forces in Siberia. And there were endless discussions of, could we do something, should we do something? But then Nixon at an NEC meeting said, the first thing we have to do is to understand who is the stronger and who is the weaker of the two sides. Because when you have two adversaries and you're concerned about both of them and they're in conflict, you should support the weaker against the stronger, because you don't want the stronger to become even more relatively stronger. At that time, we had no relations with China at all. But then it created a basis from which we could take a series of steps that led to a relationship. So this was Nixon's basic strategy. And there was another one, a sentence of his. When you think about policy, whatever you will do ultimately, or will be driven to do ultimately, better do it immediately, because then you're freed of the tactical debate.
It was in that summer of '69, there was a real possibility of war between China and Russia on the border, which wasn't widely, I guess, known and is largely forgotten, but that was the opportunity that you had to deal to balance Russia and China.
Well, when he went to China, he spent 3 whole days, from morning till night, in a dialogue with Zhou Enlai. The modern way diplomacy is conducted, heads of state never have that much time or that much reflection.
You wrote something very interesting about that, about the hours, the days of conversation that President Nixon had with Premier Zhou. You've said, no American president I encountered or studied would have been so willing to spend so much effort creating a philosophic framework. And that was certainly a characteristic of him. What difference did a philosophic framework make in terms of American interests and policy?
Well, the government is composed of, in effect, a large number of constituencies. And every big problem breaks down in its execution into a series of practical issues. And so the more complicated it becomes, the more it drags you away from the key question you should ask, one should ask as a strategist, which is, what is the purpose and what are the elements of this problem that you can use to facilitate the outcome that you have defined that requires thinking through what are the key elements, how do you define your purpose, how do you get people, how do you get the components to, if they are on your side, to operate coherently, and if they are on the other side, how you get them to a point that facilitates your objective. And this means that you cannot just simply act on the immediate symptoms of the crisis. And you also have to learn, and we're going to come up against it in the Ukraine, not only how you achieve victory, but what you do after victory, and what you want to do in reshaping the world. And when you talk about the Ukraine situation now, do we want to create a situation in which a Russia that has been stopped, which is essential, but in which that Russia then becomes open to a new relationship with the West, or whether it looks to China for its inspiration and support. So while we are fighting that war now, in which we need to defeat Russian aggression, what the next 3 moves should be.
President Zelensky certainly qualifies as a hero. How does he rank as a leader?
How does he?
Does President Zelensky rank as a leader?
How do I rank Nixon as a leader?
Zelensky as a leader.
Well, in the terms, I put him in this book of 6 great statesmen is to awaken in American thinking the significance of Nixon beyond domestic politics. And I would rank him among the very top of the international leaders that I've met, and very high in American historic in the historic role. After all, if you look at how other statesmen among whom he lived regarded him, when he lost the election, the California election in 1962, de Gaulle, who had an eagle eye for statesmen, invited him to a private meeting in Paris, and made it announced after the meeting that he considered Nixon a significant statesman. And that was when everybody said Nixon had no chance.
This greatly surprised the American ambassador, who had not acknowledged Nixon's presence in Paris until de Gaulle invited him to the Élysée, to the thing he was given, at which de Gaulle says Nixon was who had just lost the presidency and had just lost the governorship as a man with a future. When in my 1983 interviews with President Nixon, the last question I asked him was how he would like to be remembered. And I saved it for last because I was pretty sure of the way he would react, and he didn't disappoint. I asked him how he would like to be remembered, and he said, "I don't get into that kind of crap." So I'm sure the C word is occurring to you right now, but here goes. How would you like to be remembered?
No, I wouldn't express it like Nixon. I think if you attempt as a national figure or international figure to try to figure out what the public opinion will be X number of years from now, you drive yourself crazy. I think to be a great leader, you have to have a vision for your country, because great leaders move their country or their people from where they are to where they have never been. And so even you take somebody like de Gaulle or Churchill, you find no essays on how they want to be regarded in the future, but a lot of essays what they think their country, and for America, we have been so blessed with material goods that we've been able to deal with crises largely on a piecemeal basis. But that period is over for America because too many things are happening simultaneously. So that what I would feel America needs most importantly, it's a faith in a national future. Of course, there'll be lots of disagreements on tactics, but the most important thing a great leader can do is to give his society the courage to live up to its potential. And we have been, and that, strangely enough, I say strangely only because in terms of the debates that went on in Nixon's lifetime, that is what Nixon was most focused on. And on one of his last nights in office, when we were sitting together, we were discussing this subject. And I said to him, history will treat you better than your contemporaries. And he said, that depends who writes history. And I said, and he agreed, that who writes history depends in large part, on the memory that reflects society's capacity for achievement. And I think that that remains to be true. because if leaders are totally focused on themselves, they become overwhelmed by the communications of the moment, and they will spend so much of their effort on trying to figure out the angle that they forget what the direction should be. I think it's the overwhelming problem of our time.
The problem of our time now is that we're out of time. But let's agree. We'll meet here again next year. We'll celebrate your 100th birthday. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Henry Kissinger.
You made it go very smoothly.
Ladies and gentlemen, the highest award that the Nixon Foundation presents is the Architect of Peace Award. And tonight, Dr. Kissinger becomes its only two-time recipient. To bestow that award, I'd like to welcome Ling and Charlie Zhang. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. Kissinger, for honoring us, and good night.